have to say, I had never expected to be interviewed by Hendrix. This is going to be interesting.
Oh.
You're the shark.
Yeah.
You're the shark model. It's like, oh, you got very sharp teeth.
Well, you're the main character, right? The first character that's on there. Is that right?
Yeah. This is oh my God, am I gonna slip this name right now? Cosmo.
Yes, and so when I interviewed Codsworthless, I was that character, and I asked him, because I liked his character a lot, and I asked him what he thought of mine, and he was like, well, you don't look good at all. And so I thought, well, I won't do that again. Today I'm talking with Andrew Abedian, who's the senior game designer at Survios, a California-based company that develops virtual reality software and games. And so, Andrew, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? I was looking at your resume, and it looked like even pretty early on, a lot of your work related to virtual reality. So I was kind of wondering when you actually developed a passion for virtual reality. So how did your passion develop, and how did you basically come to this position?
So I didn't know that I was going to come into gaming as a VR-specific developer at all. Like, I've always wanted to be a game developer, ever since I was a little tyke. And I did everything in my power to set these goals to get into the game industry, not realizing that by the time I got here, there's going to be virtual reality as an entirely different, feature of gaming. And it was actually really early on that I was working on a game called Primal Carnage. That was like an asymmetrical multiplayer game, Mercenaries versus Dinosaurs. We were going to create a single-player version of that game, and in doing so, we actually went to get a preview of the Oculus DK1. And I was actually a huge skeptic at the time. I was just like, oh yeah, VR, it's probably going to be like misaligned or whatever, and I'm going to throw up, and it's going to feel bad. And I had essentially like no expectations whatsoever. And we went to, we were already in Vegas, so we went to a hotel room. They gave us a little private demo. And in that demo, we were just kind of going around the UDK Citadel map. I was kind of walking, I'm just like looking around, and I'm kind of stunned. It was my very first moment of just like, oh, wow, I'm like in here right now. And then of course at the end of the demo, they kind of was like, hey, do you want us to like take you all the way to the top of the map and like let you fall down? And I was like, yes, of course. So they like pulled us all the way to the top, dropped us. It was exhilarating, super excited, and immediately got sold on it. In fact, like when we went back to our office, we had an Oculus DK1. Back then, Valve was kind of hooked up like a basic TF2 integration. And I started playing it every night to just get accustomed to it. I was like, okay, well, we're going to start developing for this. Things worked out a little differently for those projects. Moving forward, I kind of kept running to VR. I kept working on VR stuff, AR stuff, smaller stuff with the gear, a lot of contract jobs, until I finally wound up working on Paranormal Activity VR, and that was on the Vive. It was the first time I had worked on the Vive. And that was I was like starting to get kind of accustomed to VR, but I had this moment where I was like looking at this wall where we had this like demonic texture and everything, and like I was so immersed that like I put my hand on the wall and I almost like fell through because I completely forgot that it wasn't there. So it was just another moment. It's like, wow, that was incredibly visceral. And of course, Paranormal Activity VR was a VR title, so I started working on that. And from that, I kind of went to Survios, knowing that, okay, I really want to work in VR as the medium now. Like, just there's so many things. Like, it's just so new, it's so exciting, there's so many possibilities. And immediately, I was drafted on to be the level designer of Raw Data. So I worked on a bunch of levels for that, worked on their intro sequences, tutorials, etc., doing some game design stuff. And then eventually, when I got to a good place with that, they had this prototype called Sprint Vector back then. It looked nothing like this, nothing. It was just like a climbing game, platforming. But already when I had played it, I was just so like, the physicality of like climbing stuff was just so amazing. I was like, I want to work on this. I kept telling the design director, like, hey, I want to work on this. I want to work on this. And then eventually it was like, all right, well, Raw Data is in a good spot. Let's have you work on this. And I was like the only designer for a while. We were trying to figure out like, okay, so where do we want to take this? It's kind of like climbing, you know, there's some other climbing stuff out there, and there's like this really big question of like locomotion, right? Like, how do we move around? And no one seems to be answering that. And we'd kind of figured some things out out just in the prototype of Sprint Vector, where it was like, well, if climbing doesn't get people sick, then maybe there's something to that interaction. And from that, I worked with the CTO, Alex Silkin, and we kind of developed a fluid locomotion system with the oversight of Mike Tires, design director at Survios. And then basically from that, I slowly transformed from the main only designer on Sprint Vector to the lead designer / project lead on Sprint Vector. And here we are.
Yeah, that's great information, Andrew. Thanks for sharing all that. The kind of talent does Survios look for in regards to game development and its employees?
There's obviously like a bunch of different departments here, and different disciplines, so each of the departments are picking out certain qualities relative to their disciplines. I can't really remark on that for each department. Obviously for design, we have very specific things that we're looking for as well. Like, for example, do you have a passion for VR? It's like one of the simplest questions that we ask, like, almost everybody actually that interviews here is like, hey, why do you want to work here? Why do you want to work in VR? And like, if you can't muster up at least the most basic, like, oh my God, it's so exciting, then, you know, maybe somewhere else. Like, because everybody here is like super excited about VR. We talk about the possibilities. We're deeply invested. We all believe in it. That's why we make these kind of games. Like, we're not, you know, we'll also, you know, eventually work in experiences and other things, but we want to make games. We want to get people playing VR and like really sell the experience.
That's awesome.
So that's I guess a smaller part of the larger culture check that we do. And culture check is really simple. Like, can I work with you day in and day out? Are we going to have problems? Like, you know, are you going to be understanding? Like, this is a very stressful environment. We look for like really top level people. And because now, as we've announced, like, we're working on multiple things at once, things can get pretty hectic, and it's important to have a good team. And we have cross teams, right? So like everybody being able to have good communication and chill with each other, and just like somebody that after work we could just hang around. And it's actually really important. It's super important that everybody here is like, it's one big family. We all understand each other, even though everybody's like super into different things, and like you could find little niches, like niches. They all interact in the exact same way. It's just that I could talk to literally anybody here, and that's amazing.
Do you generally get your creative inspiration as individuals, or do you come up with that as a team, and where does that come from?
It's a little bit of both, honestly. Like, everybody here has an idea of what they want from a VR game, and as time moves forward and more, you know, we find common ground and we start proving out features and mechanics, we all start to like get a general idea of what is a quality mechanic or interaction in VR, and then we all start kind of, I don't want to say homogenizing, but we all get on the same level, right? We all start to understand like what is meaningful in VR, what makes a VR interaction that much more impressive than a video game interaction. We do like basically like a brainstorm and everything about different ideas, and the designers get together. We're talking VR mechanics all the time, and then all of us bring something to the table from the types of games we play. I mean, even at work, there's a bunch of people that just play like board games, and there is stuff to take from every medium. You know, you take something from a board game, apply it as a mechanic, rethink it in VR. There's a lot of ways to approach these kind of things, but the most important thing is just like us being, don't be afraid to test things. Like, we try things all the time. Like, Sprint Vector is a testament to just pushing the limits of testing every single possible thing, and just seeing what sticks, and like iterating, focus testing. It's just one huge process.
Yeah, that's awesome. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that, because we actually, I don't know if you realize I'm older than the average gamer, and so my kids are all almost grown, but we have homeschooled, and so one of our big themes has been, you know, be interested, enjoy learning, and figure stuff out. So, you know, you learn the best whenever you're participating and trying stuff and failing. If you fail, then you can find ways to succeed later. And so we really have always emphasized to them, you know, failure is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. I mean, you just keep learning new ways to do it differently until you succeed. So I think that's
the whole thing, honestly. Like, not being afraid to fail is very important. And failure doesn't need to be some grand, like, oh no, I lost everything. You know, failure could just be like, I tried something out and it didn't work. Let's move on, or let's take it into a different direction. Like, failure is good. Failure means you're learning.
Well, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the specific games. I've played Raw Data and Sprint Vector, of course. Both are great. I probably prefer Raw Data, but that's just because I think I have discovered I'm a violent person, and so I really enjoy shooting things. Yeah, since I started playing VR games, I really, really like the shooting games. So, and I also play Echo Arena where I just punch people to death, and so they're always like, "You are very violent." I'm like, "It's fun." But I know that
you have no idea from my perspective how perfect this is as you as a shark right now. It's incredibly perfect.
Yeah, now you know why I chose this avatar. It just seemed to fit the best, like there was the beautiful woman, and I'm like, no, that's really not me, to be quite honest. So, I'm no longer young and beautiful, and I am quite assertive. So I figured this was a good one. But I know you guys are working on Electronauts and Creed, and so I was wondering if you could share with the viewers a little bit about how production is progressing on those.
I am not personally allowed to go too deep into those projects.
Okay.
I don't know how much I could say. I can just say that we all have, like at Survios, there's a bunch of tiny teams, and basically the Creed team is yay big, and the Sprint Vector team is yay big, and getting kind of smaller as we're going to other things. And all these products, even though they're being built with like the small teams, we all talk to each other.
Sure.
So I've actually gone in and like worked on Creed, basically worked a little bit on their locomotion and whatnot. And in the same way, I actually have had the least amount to do with Electronauts, but Electronauts is just like, oh, I'm such a fan.
Really?
It's just it's so fun, particularly in a party atmosphere. If you were to just like put on Electronauts, invite a bunch of friends over, and everybody just switches out being a DJ and essentially provides the music, and you can't mess up. It's just so great. Add some drunken, boozy, awesome, it's fantastic. Survios' objective is really to push VR forward. In every single thing that we do, we're trying to push VR forward. So if that means that we're going to be making a lot of different stuff at incredibly high quality, just because that's going to get more people into VR and then make the community even better and push mechanics, like that's what we're going to do. And for everything that we make, like fluid locomotion, like these things wrap back around and become core tech, and that core tech gets transferred from one game to another. So we're building like this huge repository of mechanics, not only for ourselves, but hopefully for our players. So like, if you go into another Survios game, fluid locomotion isn't something you need to relearn.
Right.
Maybe it's been reconfigured and, we got rid of all the crazy stuff, right?
Yeah, that's awesome.
Generally speaking, let me recenter myself.
Yeah, I know, I'm worried you're going to fall off the cliff there at the edge of the wall.
I'll be fine.
You'll just have to climb back up.
But it's at least a repository for mechanics for us, and it's finally like some sense of shared knowledge for players, so that as they go from one experience to another, they don't have to constantly relearn everything over again, which is essentially what's happening right now since VR is so new.
Yeah, I think that's great, that if you play one game, you can just carry that over to another game. And your company especially, it's interesting that you have all of your games are different genres, really. I mean, you've got totally different genres in every single one, so I think that's awesome.
Yeah, we're not afraid about, like, someone had asked us, like, why didn't we just immediately make another shooter after Raw Data? And it's like, well, one, we wanted to solve the locomotion problem with Sprint Vector, and two, like, we want to keep experimenting, and we don't want to just take one thing and just rehash it a million times until people are just bored of it. That's not really going to push anything forward. That being said, if we make another shooter, you could damn well hope, or know rather, that it's going to be great, because now we learned everything from Raw Data and we're going forward, and it's becoming a much better and more solid experience. Yeah,
that's great. Okay, so now it's time to get personal again. We're going to play a game. I'm going to ask you a question, and you get to ask me a question. So you get to play interviewer for a second. We don't want to get too personal. It's supposed to be fun, not, embarrassing or anything. But one question I had for you was, what is your favorite Survios game thus far?
Oh, that's not fair. So I've worked on Raw Data. I've worked on Sprint Vector, obviously. I really like Creed, and as I already gushed about Electronauts, I love Electronauts. I'm going to take the easy, selfish route here and say Sprint Vector. Just because lead designer, got to represent. Serious note, like, the reason I would pick it, even just unbiasedly, is just like the amount of freedom afforded by Sprint Vector
Right.
is kind of unlike anything else.
Yes.
As raw data is very empowering, and I feel like a badass, like shot down a robot and everything, and like blow stuff up. Sprint Vector lets me fly. Like, it's all built into just like the more time that I put into it, the more freedom I get to experience, and ideally, that's essentially what creates feedback loop addiction, where it's just like, well, I'm getting better. I can feel myself getting better, so I can actually feel more free, which makes me want to play more and get even more better, so I can be more free. And just, you know, hopefully, that's the idea.
I completely understand that. Do you enjoy any other VR experiences? It doesn't have to necessarily be a game, but what other VR experiences have you had that you really were impressed with?
So I don't get to play as much anymore, just because I'm so busy. That being said, like obviously, like I just said, play Beat Saber. Beat Saber is great. Like it has a level of just polish, and it's simple, but it can be as complex as the stage and the song, and it gets you sweating. It's great. I also finished Moss, like I think 2 months ago on PSVR, and that was very wonderful. Like super whimsical. I'm all in. It's great.
Yeah.
They did just enough that it totally made sense that it was in VR.
That's
like
great.
Being able to possess things and like the perspective on stuff, like as you put your head around the environment, and I don't know, it was just great. I was like, you know what? If this is someone's first experience, they're gonna leave VR being like, oh wow, like there's so much potential here. Even though it's not insanely wild, right? Like it's a platformer, but we need these like stepping stone, polished experiences to kind of get people invested.
Yeah, definitely.
And then shortly after that, I played Wipeout, and I was just like, ah, super fun.
That's great.
Yeah, I mean, if I had to say favorite, it's a little difficult, but I'll cheat. One of the first ones that fully released was The Gallery Call of Starseed, which was just an adventure-style game. But I played that from start to finish in one night, and it completely like sold me on like I could play games like this. It was very early on. It got me super immersed. Like it was just so new and fresh and amazing and exciting, and like reading stuff in the dark with a lighter, and then like all this other stuff that happens. I don't want to spoil anything, but just really well done. So
That's
that one
great.
had a decent impact.
That's great. I did have one last question for you. So basically, there was a time when television was not very common in homes. And in my home, for example, we didn't even have streaming services or cable TV or anything until just a few years ago. Basically, though, it frustrates me whenever I try to describe virtual reality and to people who haven't experienced it and they haven't been immersed in it. And they're very skeptical. And I'll say things like, you know, this technology will be used for job training or education or physical therapy, mental health counseling, because can you imagine, this is so realistic. If I'm feeling quite depressed or something, and I come in here and we can actually talk and it feels so real that you can make me feel better or you can counsel me. There's so many ways that we can use this that I think it is going to change our future. So, you know, when you talk to people and they haven't tried it and they're so skeptical, and you want to just tell them, first of all, you shouldn't even have an opinion because you haven't tried it. But I mean, honestly, I do not have much patience with people who have an opinion about things that they don't even know what they're talking about. So I was going to ask you, what do you think about the future of virtual reality?
I mean, you kind of hit a couple of really important points. Like, the reason this tech is going to not only survive, thrive, and change everything is exactly the things that we're talking about right now. Exactly this moment right now. This moment right here. It is the reason. It is so powerful. And when we talk about human beings, right? Like, we're all about tools. Is VR not one of the greatest tools that we could have made? It is the tool of creating an entirely new reality and just putting yourself literally into it. And we've always kind of been going towards this through video games and through software and through all this other stuff. Like, but this is an amazing way to teach somebody to therapy, like help people. There's so many applications here because it can simulate a reality that is harmless. Right. You can create a very specific world. You don't have to find the resources for it other than, you know, the talent to make it. But you can just make anything that you want. And that can either be something just to impress people or to comfort people, to create a sense of community, to teach people for health reasons. Like, there's so much. And it's hard to really get people invested in that idea until they've gone into VR and they kind of get a feel for the human interaction.
Right.
Like, most people say that, you know, oh, VR is so isolating. You're in a room by yourself. Like, I'm sure if you look at me right now from outside this door, it would look like the most ridiculous, schizophrenic, isolated thing that would be possible right now. But I really feel like I'm talking to you.
Exactly.
We're having a conversation. And that's just so powerful in the way we've just constantly been pushing, like, technology as a form of new social communication.
Right.
And even more so than that, just on what you were saying about, like, how things, you know, slowly evolve for television, all these other things. Like, this is really the first step. A lot of people are saying that, you know, back in the 90s was the first step and all that. That was, let's call it a prototype. This is the first step, because from this point, we're going to get real stuff, more experiences. The products are going to get smaller, they're going to get less expensive, they get more complicated. And the thing that I always pitch to people, because I had an incredible experience with the Microsoft HoloLens. Microsoft HoloLens, of course, is not a VR device, it's an AR device. But in the HoloLens, they have like this tiny rectangle of vision that eventually will become your entire periphery, that we can just draw whatever in there, right? Like, I could have a screen floating in my HoloLens headset that is just as solid and real as the one in real life. So that's just, first of all, another tool pushing everything forward. But if you start thinking about AR and VR as actually one thing, and it is a tool for simulating realities. Right. And that you would eventually be able to have a headset, and it could be literally like this slim thing that, you know, covers maybe just the front of your vision or whatever, and you could essentially slide around the amount of reality you're experiencing all the way to the end would be complete virtual reality, and everything before that is like levels of AR. And now all of a sudden you're like, wow, this is an incredibly powerful tool that, again, like the smartphone, just changes everything.
Right.
It absolutely will change everything. And if it becomes to that level of just like, hey, what mixed reality device are you using? I mean, mixed reality is Microsoft's term, but whatever.
Yeah.
What new reality device are you using? It's like, oh, I got this new one, blah, blah, and like, it's pretty cool, it's very comfortable, battery life, and everyone's just talking about it as another product like they do their phones. Like, that's gonna be it. It's gonna be over. In fact, it might just replace phones, because why not? Like, I could simulate everything in my own vision instead of looking at a screen. And guess what? If I wanted to look at a screen, maybe I just look at my hand, like hold down on my palm, and it shows the screen anyway. There's so many possibilities. It changes the way that we can intake information. It's just kind of stunning. It's just, the problem is people look at VR and they try to look for the worst example of the worst game and try to make, yeah, you're wasting your money, you're trying to poke holes into it and everything. It's unfortunate. Like, they should get in, give it an honest try. I know people are like hesitant because they're like, oh, it's gimmicky, blah, blah. It's hard to describe, but they absolutely need to commit, because like every single time I see a post about someone committing, they're like, oh my God, I was so wrong. I was so ridiculously wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's exactly my experience.
Definitely the future.
That's exactly what I thought. I mean, my husband was like, oh, let's try this. I want you to see this. Come do this. And I'm just like, oh my goodness. You know, I don't like that kind of stuff. And now, now I'm on it like, 18 hours a day.
The amazing thing is it's kind of like a reset on the way people consume information, because it's no longer abstracted behind a mouse and keyboard. Like, we're here. These are hands. I know what hands are. My head works like my head does. It's all trying to get rid of all these extra abstraction layers of interaction and just say, okay, things are as you expect them to be, but they're new and they're not real. Just accept those things and you're good.
Yeah, it's great. And I don't really stay on it 18 hours a day, but I am on it probably too much. But I do think like Star Trek and things like that we watched in the 90s, I think it's cool that I never would have envisioned some of that stuff as realistically being possible, like holograms and things like that. And now I completely think that it's just a matter of time. I mean, it's just a matter of time, and one of the neat things is being able to, like you said, the interaction. This is so real. It's like we're really here. Yes, we may be in our own physical locations, but I see some of the potential, as far as talking with a teacher, in job training, disabling bombs, or learning how to do operations, or going inside DNA in a classroom, and you can actually go in there and explore it as you go. And there's so many things.
Apollo experience and everything, like
right.
reliving a historical moment from the perspective of someone who was there, or it's like a third person, literally being in the moment. And instead of being like, okay, turn to chapter 5 and read through the pages of the questions, like, no, okay, class, put on your headsets. We're about to go see the moon landing. And now all of a sudden, instead of being some boring task, it's like, I'm experiencing the moon landing.
Right.
Wow. It's just a completely different level.
Right. Well, it's amazing. I think it's been great to chat with you about all these different topics, and I'm excited to see the new games you have coming out. I think I'm really going to like Creed, because I really like hitting things. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that. And but anyway, it was very nice to meet you. I appreciate you getting together with me.